Over on Discord, Nick England 673 asked the following question. Is it just me, or is there a noticeable difficulty spike in language in The Return of the King? That's an excellent question. Right off the bat, let's just consider some examples. Here's the final paragraph of the first chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo saw him to the door. He gave a final wave of his hand and walked off at a surprising pace. But Frodo thought the old wizard looked unusually bent, almost as if he was carrying a great weight. The evening was closing in, and his cloaked figure quickly vanished into the twilight. Frodo did not see him again for a long time. Pretty straightforward, and good writing, I'd say. Simple, easy to understand, while also being kind of emotional and ominous. Now, let's compare that to the final lines from The Siege of Gondor, which is the 4th chapter in The Return of the King. In that very moment, away behind in some courtyard of the city, a cock crowed. Shrill and clear he crowed, recking nothing of wizardry or war, welcoming only the morning that in the sky far above the shadows of death was coming with the dawn. And as if in answer there came from far away another note, horns, horns, horns. In dark Mindoluin's sides they dimly echoed, great horns of the north wildly blowing. Rohan had come at last. Pretty different. I could do, honestly, a whole video just on that last paragraph, but I'm not going to get sidetracked, maybe later. The question here is the writing in The Return of the King more difficult to read than in The Fellowship of the Ring? Now, I did address this a little while ago on a live stream, but I wanted to dig into it a little more. Now, even just considering those two examples, it kind of feels intuitive that the answer would be yes, and that is the answer I came to on the live stream. But is that true? Well, let's dig a little deeper. To figure this out, I did two things. First, I selected 3 random descriptive paragraphs from each volume of the book and did a cursory analysis of each one. Next, I looked at dialogue from a single character, Pippin in this case, over the same periods in the book. Now, we'll get to Pippin in a moment. First, though, let's start with those paragraphs. We'll go back to book 1, in this case it's chapter 9, and this is where the hobbits have arrived in Bree. So let's go ahead and put that paragraph there on screen. I looked here at several factors. First, sentence length, as in how many words per sentence on average. Next, punctuation. Periods, commas, question marks, exclamation marks, those are all normal. Anything else, though, gets flagged, since they may stop some readers' flow if they're not as used to running into things like colons, semicolons, em-dashes, parentheses, and so on. Next, I looked at Germanic versus Latinate word usage, which I talked a lot about in a previous video. The gist of it is, it's about the origin of words. English is at its root a Germanic language, but we've borrowed a ton of words from other languages, primarily Latin. Now, I got into the whys and wherefores in that other video, and I don't want to get bogged down here, so if you want to learn more about that, check out the other video right here. Lastly, I looked at broad, and I do mean broad, sentence structure. You could spend hours and hours diagramming and getting to the grammatical root of each phrase and clause and sentence. And just to be upfront with any true grammarians out there, I did not do that. All I was looking for was broadly abnormal sentence structures. And what do I mean by that? Well, English is what we call an SVO language, meaning subject, verb, object. So, Luke uses the Force. Luke is our subject, uses is our verb or action, and the Force is our object or the thing that is being acted upon by the subject. Most sentences in English will follow this basic structure. But for a familiar example, Yoda sounds odd because he often changes up his sentence structure. So he might say, the Force Luke uses, changing it to OSV, or object, subject, verb. We do this sometimes for emphasis or questions or what have you, but like I said, English is typically subject, verb, object. So anything other than that gets flagged for potentially slowing the reader down. You'll see more about what I mean in just a bit. Okay, so back to our example from early on in the book. This one is 91 words long, it's only 3 sentences, so it clocks in at a whopping 30 words per sentence. Of those words, at least the ones he didn't make up, like Frodo or Bree, 81% of them are Germanic and 14% are Latinate. Now keep in mind that, as a rule, the more Latinate a sentence is, the more conversational it will probably be, at least in standard narrative prose like this. We're going to leave academic and scientific papers out of it for now. Now, as for punctuation, there are a couple parentheticals in there, and they do some funny things to the sentence when we're looking at word order. Everything else in the paragraph is standard SVO word order, And then you have these two parenthetical dependent clauses that seem out of place, like they may be screwing things up. So if we're being overly pedantic, we could flag those in our word order counter, but I'm not going to. While parentheticals do complicate a sentence on a technical level, ask yourself this: does it make the sentence harder to read? In fact, this actually dovetails quite nicely with the issues of punctuation and sentence length. In this case, parentheses make a sentence look more complicated. And when you're looking at a book and reading it, that does mean something. But in fact, I would argue that they give the paragraph a more natural style that mirrors actual thought and speech more closely than the other examples that we'll get to. We think and talk in parentheticals all the time, even though we might not realize it. And when it comes to sentence length, it feels intuitive to think that the longer the sentence, the tougher it is to read, right? And sometimes that's true, no doubt, but think of it this way. Every sentence is a separate thought that requires your brain to reset, change gears, shift focus just a bit. So, although the sentences are long, there are only 3 of them in the whole paragraph, and they flow in a very natural, easy-to-read way. So, while Tolkien doesn't write in the way most authors do today, and it might take some time to get used to his personal style, this first example I would say is pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Now, let's look at an example from The Two Towers. This is Book 3, Chapter 6. It's when Gandalf and Aragorn first come to Edoras and meet with King Theoden, and we get a description of Éowyn. This paragraph is 151 words, clocking in at 19 words per sentence. So there are 8 sentences. Already more gear switching to do in this paragraph than in the first one. There are 2 punctuation outliers here, a colon and a semicolon, and these may not trip you up, but again, they could slow down somebody who isn't as used to them, so it's good to recognize that they're there. The Germanic word usage here jumps all the way up to 90%, which is remarkably high. In fact, out of 151 words, only 12 of them are of Latinate origin. And honestly, once you start paying attention to this sort of thing, that's impressive. And then we come to word order, and the contrast with the last example is massive. I count 14 major clauses here. And again, I'm being very, very broad. I'm not trying to get every single noun-verb cluster in there. But anyway, out of those 14 clauses, fully 5 of them are an alternate structure. So you get things like, very fair was her face, or still as stone she stood. There's your tongue twister. Put it all together, and I think it's pretty fair to say that this paragraph is a little tougher than the first one. But what about the last one? Well, for that we turn to The Return of the King. This is Book 5, Chapter 4. 96 words, 5 sentences for 19 words per sentence, same as the last one. There's no difficult punctuation to worry about, that's nice, and the Germanic versus Latinate split is, again, almost identical to the last example, 89% to 8%. And the word order choices are also similar here, with 2 out of 7 major clauses being outside the normal SVO style. No hours so dark had Pippin known is definitely an archaic construction, although the other one, wait he did, is a little different. It's a more familiar construction that we still use today for emphasis. And it even has a nice little wordplay in there, so it was his duty to wait upon the Lord, and wait he did. Now, are these 3 examples enough to come to any academically defensible conclusions? No, of course not. But it does give us some little snapshots and an idea of some of the things we could look at as we consider the question of whether The Lord of the Rings gets harder to read as you go. And there's something else that can help us illustrate our point, or rather someone, Pippin. Now here's what I did with Pippin. I selected 3 chapters and looked at all of Pippin's dialogue from each of those chapters, looking in this case just for out-of-the-norm sentence structures, the SVO thing. So I looked through Book 1, Chapter 4, that's still in the Shire, then Book 3, Chapter 9, the aftermath of the Battle of Isengard, and finally Book 5, Chapter 1, when he arrives at Minas Tirith and gets the grand tour of the city. And yep, there's Pippin, all in yellow. Now, with these passages, I did a quick scan, so it's very possible that I missed something, and you can let me know in the comments if you think I did. But in Pippin's case, I only noticed 2 abnormal sentence constructions, and both of them came in The Return of the King. My favorite is when Pippin is pledging his service to Denethor. He says, "Little service, no doubt, will so great a lord of men think to find in a hobbit." By the way, when I was typing that into Google Docs, it had an absolute cow over that sentence construction. Anyway, it's an excellent illustration because here we have Pippin, possibly the most casual speaker of any of the major cast, who only speaks in the most straightforward way. But when he's speaking to the ruler of Gondor, trying to project some pride and confidence, he mirrors him, speaking in a way that he thinks Denethor will respond to. And as far as mirroring goes, he's not wrong. Denethor, just on that same page, says things like, "Whence came this?" and "So mighty a man as he was." In fact, scanning just around those few pages, Denethor uses that OSV, object, subject, verb construction, a lot. So yeah, it's a pretty good bet on Pippin's part that if he wants to impress Denethor, that's a good way to mirror him. As far as dialogue goes, this pattern repeats itself a lot throughout the whole book. The hobbits are our casual, modern characters, and they speak that way. But the deeper into Middle-earth they go, the deeper into fairy, as Tolkien would say, the more archaic and heroic the world becomes. And its other characters reflect that. So the more we interact with people like Denethor or Faramir or the Mouth of Sauron or whoever, the more of those archaic constructions we get. And we haven't even gotten to archaic word choices yet. Maybe we'll do that in another video. But one last note on this dialogue point. Some characters, like Pippin and Sam, are always casual SVO speakers. Others, like Denethor, are always more high-spoken and archaic. But it's fun to spot some of the others in the middle, like Aragorn and Gandalf, who are excellent at what's called code switching. They can adjust their speech patterns to fit the situation and the participants in a conversation. And by the time you've gotten to Return of the King, you're expected to be able to do that as well. As the character balance tilts toward the heroic, as the story tilts toward the heroic, the dialogue will often become a little more archaic and heroic and, yeah, difficult. But it's not just the dialogue. Earlier, we went over those example paragraphs, and then I did a little scan through a few other scenes in the book. And the patterns we've been talking about are very much mirrored in the narration as well as the dialogue. Now, obviously, there's more to it than just word order or Germanic word usage or what have you. But however we want to define it or measure it, there do seem to be a lot of instances of this archaic, heroic language later in the book. The Charge of the Rohirrim, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, they are riddled with this stuff. So, after all that, we need to answer Nick England 673's question. Is there a notable difficulty spike in the language in The Return of the King? If you find the type of archaisms we've been talking about a little tougher to digest than a more conversational style, then yes, absolutely. It's fair to say that it gets more difficult as you go. But let me throw one wrinkle in there, and this is a totally subjective point, but I am backed up by no less than W.H. Auden, who said in his review of The Return of the King in 1956 that he enjoyed the final part of The Lord of the Rings more than the beginning because a lot of the stuff in the Shire and about the Shire is light comedy, and light comedy is not Mr. Tolkien's forte. Indeed. It's not so much that he's bad at it, but he's so good at the epic, heroic stuff that it makes the stuff in the beginning feel a bit weaker. Tolkien is so in his element in The Return of the King that, to me, it feels more natural and effortless on his part, and thus, it's more natural and effortless for me to read. Now, I'm sure some of you agree, and others think I'm crazy. Either way, let me know in the comments, or if you have questions or other topics you'd like me to address, throw those in there as well. Thank you to Nick England 673 for asking this question. It was an incredibly fun one to dig into, and it did take a little bit of digging. So if you'd like to support what I do here on the channel, please check out the Patreon page and throw a buck in the tip jar there. Huge thanks to the patrons who already do so, and thanks to everybody else for watching. I will see you next time.